Hello, everyone. I am really excited to have this conversation with Adar Ayira. Adar is an anti racism, anti oppression consultant, educator, and advocate. I'm really eager to hear from Adar on the current state of race in the US. Particularly, I want to hear Adar talk about whether the current movements we've seen around race are structural or symbolic. So,
Oh,
Adar, welcome. I'm so happy you've joined us for this conversation.
thank you for inviting me. I always love hanging out with you, Wendy.
Yes, I love, and I will say that I learned from Adar. Adar is friend, colleague, accountability partner, brainstorm partner. We do all of
Same,
this together.
same, Wendy. Same. Back at you.
So I'm excited to have this conversation. Adar, could you tell us a little bit about yourself and your work?
So I will say so. Just the short take that I have been so privileged, Wendy, to be able to work with grassroots nonprofits, establishment nonprofits, corporations, foundations, community groups, individuals to really help them explore and expand their understanding about anti-racism, anti-oppression, and how it manifests, and also how we can resist um, these structural and individual oppressions and assaults in the United States, because my work is primarily in the United States. But I've also had the privilege and the opportunity to collaborate and to learn with and grow from people in other countries who are working on these same issues in their countries. So I really enjoy that because while we know that racism and white supremacy is global, is worldwide, it is always so interesting to see how these things manifest in different countries according to their histories and what it looks like in those countries. So I feel like the most privileged person in the world to be able to do this work.
Thank you. And so, speaking of the United States, this year has been a really tumultuous one for the entire world, but
It
for the
has.
US, we've had both this intersection of COVID and this new focus on police brutality towards Black people. So, we just elected a woman of color to the vice president role. And so, a lot of people are talking really openly about race right now, more than I believe I've heard before. And many people feel that we have turned a corner on racism in this country. So, tell me what you think about that.
No, we have not. You know, we often do not make the distinction between diversity and inclusion, and God knows we misuse the word equity. Um, Diversity is a cheek in the seat, right? Or the yeah, the
A
yeah,
cheek in the
that's it, the
seat.
cheek
I
in the
love
seat,
it.
right? Listen, I use that all the time
Say
because
what
that
say what
is
it
what
is.
it is.
Cheeks in the
It's a
seat.
simple way of explaining it, right?
Right.
But people of color can promote and advance white supremacy and racism just as much as a white person can. And I'm not speaking ill of the vice president. Don't get me wrong, but I'm just saying that just looking at a person who is there and divorcing them from the power structure that surrounds them, from their history of policies and positions, right? That's something that we tend to do, which is something that we should not tend to do because we end up getting disappointed. So, no, I don't think that we have turned a corner. We've seen a re entrenchment of white supremacy and racism in politics as well as in other areas of life. We can look at who has access to the COVID vaccine and see the disparities there, right? We see a former president who incited an insurrection And we see that person, as well as the people who were around him, getting off scot-free. And meanwhile, there are plenty of Black and brown people, in prison for stealing a piece of bread or smoking a joint. And you're telling me that that is more serious than an insurrection? I don't think so. So we see a re-entrenchment, and what we also see, and just going back to what you're sharing, Wendy, about more conversation. Yeah, I don't think that I've heard the terms white supremacy or systemic racism be mentioned in 1 year as much, as we have heard them this year. In 30 years, I've not heard them
Right.
mentioned like in a public sphere as much as we have this year. But the other thing that we have seen is the way in which these terms have been bastardized, the way in which they have been reframed and reshaped, softened in order to make them palatable to a white population that we all need to get on the bandwagon for justice, right? And
Yes.
in doing so, that has not operated um, for justice, nor for Black liberation, nor for any other liberation. It just hasn't. But what it has done is it has given us a way of saying, oh, look at the progress that has been made. And so that has been more symbolism over transformative actions, transformative policies. And, in softening terms, in reframing terms, we often miss out on the ways in which doing those things still prioritizes the comfort of
Mm,
white people,
mm,
right? And still puts their comfort over a sense of fairness
mm,
and of justice, of equity, and increasingly of democracy, which
mm.
we saw in the last election. So, just as an example, right now, even as we speak, state legislators, and I think it's like 28 different states have filed over 100 bills um, that will, if they are successful, suppress the Black and brown vote. There is a silence around that. I mean, we may hear it once or twice on a news show, but there is not the outrage, there is not the airtime that is given to these bills that will have the impact of suppressing the Black and brown vote, even when this is being done in plain sight.
Mm.
But where is the outrage,
Right.
Wendy?
Right.
Where is the call to action? Where is the, oh my God, this is going to happen? Because we know that if this were about suppression of a majority white vote, there would be 24/7 news coverage of it.
Mm-hmm.
So we see this re-entrenchment in terms of policy, but it's not just the policy, it is also the white silence
Mm.
of white citizens that accompany it. So, I don't want to be like 100% doom and gloom, because there has been some great movement forward. But if we're talking about progress that is coming in terms of a policy and a transformative change with a transformative impact for Black people and other non-Black people of color, we're still waiting for that to happen.
But the president just signed an equity bill, some new equity legislation, right?
So remember when I talked about the way that terms are bastardized?
Mhm.
We can't talk about equity without talking about reparations. We can't say, listen, we're going to have policy that is going to be more just for everybody. And we're going to call that repair. That's not repair. That's something that the country should have been doing from day one. So the country is just catching up. Now, what what will be hopefully transformative about that piece of legislation is the way that it impacts lessons child poverty.
Mm-hmm.
And we'll see whether that happens. But then in that, you also have a Lindsey Graham who was on news shows bemoaning the fact that Black farmers have received reparations because there is policy now that acknowledges the harm that was done to them because of the policy advantages that were given white farmers. Right?
Right.
So if we were talking equity, we wouldn't just be talking, okay, Black farmers are now being seen as, as having a fair chance. We would be talking about not just what they are receiving that mitigates some of the damage done. We will be talking about everything that mitigates all of the damage done. Then we can talk about equity. But until then, what we're really talking about is more and fairer inclusion.
Uh-huh.
Not reached equity yet because we're not talking about repair. Repairing the generations of damage done. And Americans, mostly white Americans, they still are not on board with repair. So if you're not on board with repair, you can't say to me that you're on board with equity.
So to your point that there are all these policies right now, and some of them are pretty transactional, I think is what you're saying.
Absolutely.
And then there are ones that are transformative in a very negative way, and they're not getting any attention. So in some ways, is it that these policies, like the equity policy, sort of superficial approach to equity is what is comfortable right now? Is that what you're saying?
The approach to more fairness. Let's call it that, because framing, you know how I feel like framing is everything, right? So we can talk about more fairness, and I'm, I think that is an accurate characterization. We can talk about the positive impacts of those very specific pieces of legislation that will transform the lives of people who so desperately need it, who have been ignored and deliberately thrown in to conditions that are much worse. Right? So this is meaningful, but let's not call it what it is not. And what it is not is equity.
Thank you for that. You used a term that I have heard people throw around a lot, this term white supremacy. I've heard a lot of people talking about white supremacy now, more than I ever have. But sometimes I'm not sure about how people are using this term. Can you talk a little bit about what it means exactly?
Yes. So white supremacy is really a belief that white culture or whiteness culture or whiteness practices, the attitudes, the beliefs, the standards, the history, the values, that is the thing to be reached for. That is the standard by which everything else is weighed and measured, right?
You mean kind of like how the white man's ice is colder?
Absolutely. Absolutely like that. Even when it is some mediocre, halfway melting ice, we're still going to look at it and say, ooh, that is so much better. And it costs more than this completely frozen ice, right? That is sold by a person of color. Yes. So that belief, that philosophy is really the foundation of racism in the United States, right? That this is what people have to aspire to, that this is what is seen as professional, that it is what is seen as like our business standard. And that's the thing that we have to have. I mean, in 2020 and 2021, that there has to be, and I know that this is close to our hearts, a Crown Act.
Right.
Says that businesses cannot discriminate against Black women or Black men because we choose to wear our hair natural, that too is business, that too is professional. So here we are 400 some years in this American experiment, and we have to have that Crown Act, and there will still be people who will take a look at our hair and feel like it is not really professional, right? Because we are measuring that against this white standard of what is appropriate. So that is part of white supremacy. And where the confusion comes in is that a lot of times people will think, oh well, for a person to be a white supremacist, it means that they have to have an open hatred of Black people, an active hatred of Black people. No, it doesn't mean that. That is an extreme measure of that. But we can look at, instead of individual actions, which is what people love to look at, right? Like white men marching through Charlotte, right? Or the insurrection of the Capitol. But they didn't even call it white supremacy when there was a white man holding a Confederate flag walking through the walls of, through the floors of Congress. They would not call it white supremacy even
Right.
then, right? But it's not about only people having this open, virulent hatred. It is also about our policies, our municipal policies, our state policies, our federal policies that have always in this country, whether it was made explicit by naming race or not, serve to advantage
Yeah.
groups of white people at the expense of groups of people of color. And that's not to say, Wendy, that all white people will gain 100% of the benefits and advantages of whiteness.
Right.
But it is to say that you never have to fear that the system is working against you, right? As one person described it, it is the difference between swimming with the tide and the advantages of that, or trying to swim against the tide,
Mm.
right? And the other thing that always comes up that I hear as a facilitator and trainer and educator is people saying, but white people saying, but I worked hard, but I didn't do anything to Black people, brown people. And the reality is that you don't have to do anything. And of course you worked hard.
Right.
We worked hard too.
Right.
But there were policies in place that supported, that cleared the way for, that rewarded the hard work that you and your family put in. You were swimming with the tide. Whereas for us and for ours, there were policies, there were processes, there was a societal culture that worked against us. And so we're caught swimming upstream, right? And whether you as an individual supported it, didn't support it, loved it, didn't love it, didn't love it, whatever, you still benefited from it.
Right.
And so when we talk about white supremacy, a lot of people think we're talking about people. And although there are some people who are white supremacists, we're talking about a system of white supremacy that is in the DNA of this country, as well as in many of our foundational documents.
It's so interesting, though. Some people would say, just hearing the description of white supremacy, like, what's wrong with professionalism, or what's wrong with showing up a certain way? I mean, how do institutions survive if there aren't some protocols for how people do things? I hear that all the time.
Yeah, and this isn't a protocol conversation. This isn't a conversation about professionalism, it in itself. This is a conversation about who standards and who gets to decide,
Right.
right?
Right.
And what it is within institutions. And the way in which it is white supremacist has been that those standards have been set by white people.
Mhm.
And if other people of color don't want to meet those standards because we have our own standards that are just as professional, right? That are of excellence, right? But if those are our standards and you reject them, that you have final say and that your word is law for everything, and that is something that advantages you and yours. There is no wide space where we can talk about a multitude of standards that are just as professional. In the United States of America, there has only been one space and one standard set by one group of people, and that is the problem.
Yes. Thank you for that. I always like to say in these conversations that white supremacy is not based on race, and that, in the sense of who struggles with it, right? So as a Black woman, I am every day trying to root the white supremacy out of me because I've been socialized into whiteness,
All
both
of us
in
have.
Jamaica and in this country,
Yeah,
right? I've been socialized into
yeah.
Eurocentric standards.
All
So
of us have. And that's the thing, Wendy, that it doesn't take a white person to uphold white supremacy. And this is why diversity is like this false progress thing, right? I, as a Black person, could anywhere I go uphold white supremacist practices. We both can name a whole bunch of Black people who do, right? Right off the top of our head. But
oh
this
yeah.
isn't about that. So we won't go that deep. Um, but we could hold up white supremacy, just as there are white people who can work against white supremacy. And again, I get back to that's why the whole diversity frame does not work. Because in the diversity frame, we just want a cheek and a seat. And so you can get people who are of color who come in more than ready and willing to uphold white supremacist practices. And
ab-
we know that there are plenty of organizations that are Black led organizations that hold up those practices.
Absolutely.
So we have to move beyond talking about diversity and really talk about the analysis that people who are the cheeks in those seats hold. Is the analysis a liberation analysis or is it not? And that is the question, even more than the question of what race they are.
That's right.
What is their analysis? Is it Black liberation? Is it liberation? Or is it diversity? And I'm here to uphold the status quo, way things are.
I always say diversity is a really low bar, but we keep reaching for it as a society.
Sure
And
do. No, you know what? We don't keep reaching up for it. We keep reaching down to pick it up, and carry it with us
right.
because it is the lowest bar that you can have, and it's a transactional bar. It's not a transformative bar. Diversity is not about transformative change. Diversity is about comfort. It is about taking out and ignoring the power equation and just concentrating on race, which is why you can have a company with 100 employees and you can have the president CEO say, oh, but we're really diverse, our workforce is pretty much 50-50. And then when you look at who the people who are in the suites, it's still all white, like a white citizens council meeting. And then you have people who are the frontline workers, who are the people of color. And that is diversity if you're just going by numbers. But that is white supremacy, right? If you are going by who holds power, who manages power, who wields power, who does or does not share power. So the diversity bar, you really have to reach down for it. pick it up and intentionally pack it and carry it wherever you are going.
I love that. And then I would love to have a later conversation with you about the 8 types of power because you taught me about that.
I would love to do that. Yes, because we know that if we can identify the tables where we sit, and if we can identify the forms of power that we hold, then we know how we can resist in any given situation. And what is my motto, Wendy? We can resist. That doesn't mean we have to lose our job because we all have bills to pay.
That's right.
But it does mean that wherever we are privileged to be, we cannot just be there for ourselves and our own comfort. We have to act for justice and for our people. Because if we don't, then we are just a wasted cheek in the seat.
Hmm.
We're not doing the work that we should be there to do for justice.
I agree. And there are lots of wasted cheeks
I right?
but so, okay, but so do you think it is possible for this country to overcome its legacy of racial oppression? And if it is, what's it going to take to achieve that? I know, $6 million question.
I am not hopeful. I'm not. I am not hopeful. And I'm not hopeful because we've been trying for more than 400 years here. And so I often ask myself, good God Almighty, what does it take? So I'm not hopeful, and I'm not hopeful because we continue to do the same things. We do continue to prize the symbolism, over the substance. Of change. We do continue to prioritize the comfort of white people. We do continue to deliberately ignore how power operates. We want to pretend that it doesn't exist. We continue to deliberately do the false equivalencies. And we have now white people who insist upon a um, a concept of anti-whiteness, which is not and never has been a thing in America. Yet they feel very victimized because of the move toward racial justice, right?
Hmm.
Um, and and because of the reentrenchment that we see, 77 plus million people voted in the last election for a white supremacist or a white nationalist.
White nationalist, yes.
That is, I mean, it is amazing to think of that. And it is amazing to think of the risk that puts all of us in every day. I mean, we know what is out there. And, again, with this white insurrection that has not been punished, we have seen America's appetite
Yes.
for these same things happening again and again. When we look at the murderer of George Floyd is going on trial. When we look at, you know, all of um, the the people who have been let off, who have gotten off from killing innocent Black people.
Yeah.
I mean, those are indicators of where we are. You know, when we look at economic outcomes, when we look at social outcomes, when we look at health outcomes, when we look at wealth outcomes, when we look at access and opportunity, Wendy, I am not going based on what I feel. I'm going based on the data that I see, right? As well as the societal attitudes that I see, and as well as the policies that I see are being put forward,
Yeah.
and the support that I see around them, and support that I don't see, right? Not only that, but I also realize that in order for the United States of America to move toward racial justice, it would have to let go of the mythology that it has had about itself for 400 plus years.
What's that mythology?
Some of it is that everyone has a fair and equal chance, that if only you work hard and pull yourselves up by your bootstraps, then you too can have a shot at the American dream. The mythology is that, if you are shot in the back by someone in authority, right? And when I say in authority, I'm not just talking about policemen and women. I'm talking about anybody with a gun who is willing to use a stand your ground defense and get away with it, right? Or anybody who can walk in a Walmart, take off their mask, and throw things on the floor when store managers or employees say, "Put on your mask. We don't want you to endanger us." And then they're just escorted from the store to go on their merry way.
Hmm.
Right? Those are the things that I'm talking about, and there is a tolerance for that. And so when we look at what the United States of America is willing to tolerate, and from whom, because that tolerance is not equal.
It's not universal.
It is not
You and
universal.
I don't get the same tolerance.
We do not get that. We do not get that,
Don't get
Wendy.
that. No.
So when we look at that, it tells us something, right? When we look at the way that the United States of America still is not ready to face up to the enormity of its crime against humanity. I
Mhm.
mean, we see that with all of the pushback of the 1619,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
And when people are still ready to say, no, we're not going to look at that, we are going to impact, or we're going to put forward legislation that says that we have to have patriotic curriculum. It's a thing. So when we look at things like that, Wendy, that tells us something about this country's and the people in this country, their willingness to go along with the myths
Mhm.
as long as they can remain comfortable with that mythology. And as long as they do not have to look at the crimes against humanity and those continuing impacts of the crimes against humanity, because it's not just the crimes against humanity against Black people, but there are Native Americans in there. There are Asian Americans
Mhm.
in there, right? Um, and so we're not willing to hold up the mirror
Mhm.
and to look at the bad in the same way that we're willing to hold up the mirror and say, well, here's some things that we did right.
Right.
And as long as we're not willing to do that, there is no way that we can step forward in the fullness of measure that we need to in order to become transformed as a society. When you look at the unwillingness um, to acknowledge that there is repair that needs to be made, to acknowledge that the wealth of this country, right, was built on the backs of the people who, not only the people who were enslaved, but the everyday people who have been working, whose tax dollars have gone in the public till, and that public till was used to make investments in majority white communities, while disinvesting in the communities of the people where a lot of that money came from. When we're not willing to look at everyday things that go on like that, continuing even now, it says something about where we are willing to stay as opposed to where we are willing to go.
Do you find that even people who are interested in being allies and accomplices are also very quick to accept and believe that we are making changes? What do you think that does to us as a society if we take every transactional, symbolic policy or action as a sign of transformative change?
I think that it upholds white supremacy. And I also, one thing that I continue to hear is, well, I was an ally, but now I'm not because you did whatever, whatever. You didn't affirm me. You made me feel uncomfortable. You did this and this. And because you did this, Wendy, because you did this, Adar, I'm no longer an ally now. You pushed me into the other camp. And it's like, okay, then you weren't an ally before. I mean, let's just not front, right? And the reality is, even when we look at the voting, right? We often want to say, oh yes, it's just that the older generation needs to die out, and then there will be racial equity because the younger generation is not like that. But when it is true that younger generations have friendships, a greater percentage of friendships across racial lines. But when it comes to conversations of power, their attitudes are similar to the attitudes of the generations before them. So, again, it gets back to not justice, but, we will ride with you as long as we're comfortable and don't have, as long as we don't have to lose something that makes us uncomfortable. But when we do, then we have to jump off this train.
It's so interesting. It almost feels sometimes as though the last year, the all the pressure of the police, the protests against the police, people were. It seems as though some people were so anxious for it to be resolved, and then after the election, they were like, "See, it's all over. It's all done. We've moved on." Very, very quick and happy to grasp at those solutions and claim them as real as opposed to symbolic.
So I want you to remember back to some conversations we had about this when
Yes.
I said this very thing, when I talked about, my concern about a Biden Harris win would be that white people would then say, okay, we good now,
Done.
and would move on to the next flavor of the month cause,
Mhm.
right? Because for them, they're good now.
Right.
Because when the former president was in office, or the former resident was in office, their futures and the futures of their children were being threatened in a way that they had not seen before.
Right.
But now that this administration is in office, there has been a restabilization for them,
For white people.
for white people,
Right.
whereas for people of color and African descendants, African Americans, Black people, we have gone back to a similar status quo of before the last resident. It has not been that things have changed so drastically. It has been that there has been a leveling and a balance back to, some of the way things were.
Yes.
And so maybe we will get, another thing here or there. I'm not discounting that. But again, it's the difference between transactional and transformative. And I am very sure that we will get some transactional. We have to, as big of a base as, African American women in particular, and men too, as big of a base as we were for Biden Harris, we have to get some transactional, right? Other groups who supported that ticket in huge percentages will have to get some transactional. But if we're talking justice, and if we're talking racial justice, and if we're talking liberation, which those things are my conversation, then we cannot have a transactional conversation. If we're not talking about transformation of this society, then we might as well not be talking, because we're just talking about the same old thing.
So then, Adar, in light of that, how do you maintain hope? How do you maintain hope and focus and continue doing this work, knowing what you know?
I stand on the shoulders of my ancestors. I am so clear about that. Um, there were so many people who got us to this point. We are the beneficiaries of their lives, of the lynchings, of the rapes, of the murders, of the lands lost. We are the beneficiaries of all of those things when they had absolutely no protections, legal protections at all. We're the beneficiaries, we are the legacies. And so I often think, Wendy, that for them to do so much with so little, who are we to do a little
With a
with
lot.
so much in comparison? You know what I mean?
I love that.
So, I always think of the freedom fighters. Before we began, I showed you my grandmother's grandmother, my great aunt, my grandfather, right? I shared with you some of my family history, which I keep around me because it reminds me that it's not just the names that we know, that it is the everyday people, because my people are everyday people who got up in the face of white supremacy and who kept it moving,
Yes.
right? um, they faced a country who hated them. Not that it doesn't hate us, but hated them without the protections that we have that were built on their backs and in their blood,
Right.
right?
Right.
So I remember those people, and I also remember the people who could no longer face it, who self-medicated, who checked out, you know, who knew that they would be murdered and maybe just laid it down because they were so tired, right? We all owe them a debt. And my doing this work, the privilege that I have of doing this work, is not so much that I believe in this country. It is that I believe in my people. I believe in the debt I owe them. I believe in their resilience. I believe in their sense of justice, right? And 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 I believe that they made a promise to us through their lives and sacrifices. So I always have that on my mind, but not just looking past, because I am like a Sankofa bird, Wendy. I look in the past, but I also look to the future, because the same legacy that we have from them is a legacy that I hope that my small insignificant life and my small insignificant work can help build for my niece, who I just love to bits and pieces, and other people's nieces and sons and daughters. I mean, all of our family, because the debt that we owe to the people who came before is a promise that we owe to
Yeah.
those who come after us. So that is the thing that keeps me going. I don't pin my hopes on this country. I pin my hopes on my people and their hunger for justice and their sense of justice and their hunger for liberation. And that is all of those things is what keeps me going. It is worth waking up for in the morning, and it is worth continuing to work for. And I will continue to do this work until the day I die, because that is the debt that I owe, not only to those who come before, but to those who will come after.
I can't add anything to that. That was beautiful. Thank you so much for taking this time to talk to us,
Thank
Adar.
you. It's always fun hanging out with you. You always have something new and different. I never know what you're going to come up with, but I always love it.
I love it. I love it. And I learn from you every day. And I'm really grateful for this community of people who are doing this work, because I know that I wouldn't still be doing it if it weren't for all of my community, people that I know are in the work, that I know I can go to. I have lots of questions. I struggle with my own white supremacy. I always need accountability. And it's people like you that I go to. So I thank you for that.
No, I feel the same way. And I just want to leave everybody with one word that you will be familiar with: Ubuntu.
Ubuntu. And what does Ubuntu
That
mean?
I am because we are.
That's right.
And that is our community.
That's
And I am so grateful that you are a part of mine. Thank you.
likewise. Thank you so much, Adar.
My pleasure.